Unlike losing it, which is just Bliss's point of view, faking it is a dual POV. So we have Kate's point of view and Max's point of view. So I'm going to read a little bit of his and then a little bit of hers. So again, this is close to the beginning. We've already reached the point where Max has asked Kate to pretend to be her boyfriend, and I'm going to start with the arrival of her parents. They haven't really had much time to talk about anything, so he has no idea anything about this girl except what he can see on the surface. Maybe I'm the right place. Hold on. Okay, sorry. So her mom's just arrived. Mackenzie! Oh, Mackenzie, honey! Mackenzie. She didn't look like a Mackenzie. She took a shuddering breath and then stood to face the woman I supposed was her mother. I rose with her and let my arm stretch across her shoulder. She seemed frazzled, which was funny because up until now, confidence was practically running out of her pores like honey. I mean, she'd asked a complete stranger to pretend to be her boyfriend. She had seemed fearless. Parents were apparently her kryptonite. I looked at the middle-aged couple approaching us. The man was balding with wire-rimmed glasses, and the woman's hair was graying at her temples. The hands between them were intertwined, and their outer arms were stretched outward like they expected their daughter to run up for a group hug. She looked like she'd rather run off a cliff. I smiled. This I could do. I gave her shoulder a squeeze and said, "Everything's going to be okay." "Boo-boo bear, oh honey, what atrocious thing have you done to your hair? I told you to stop using those dyes out of the box." Mackenzie was biting down her lips so hard as her mother pulled her forward into a hug that I was surprised she didn't draw blood. Her father took over and she had to let go of my hand. I stepped to the side and reached a hand out to her mother. "It's so nice to meet you, Mrs. The words were already out of my mouth before I realized I had no idea what Mackenzie's last name was. Hell, I hadn't even known her name was Mackenzie. Her mother took my hand and was looking at me with her head cocked sideways, waiting for me to finish my sentence. I saw Mackenzie wiggle out of her father's hug next to me, her face full of slowly dawning horror. Damn it. I put on my best smile and said, "You know, I've heard so much about you from Mackenzie that I feel I should just call you Mom." Then I moved in for a hug. Chapter 4, Max. He was hugging my mother. A total stranger. I could only handle a few hugs a year from her without feeling smothered, and he was wrapped up in her boa constrictor arms for 3, 4, 5 seconds, and it was still going. And it was a full-on hug, not one of those awkward side ones that I gave my dad. Jesus Christ, her head was tucked under his chin. His chin! The seconds seemed to expand into lifetimes, and his wide eyes caught mine over my mother's head. From the way my mother was latched on, he was never going to get free. It was like one of those sad stories where a little kid smothers a cat because he hugs it too hard. He laughed and patted her on the back. Unlike my laughs around my parents, he managed to pull it off without sounding like he was being held at gunpoint. Finally, after a nearly 10-second hug, she released him. At 10 seconds, I would have been hyperventilating. Then again, she probably wouldn't have let me go after 10 seconds. I'm convinced she thinks if she could just hug me long enough, she'd squeeze all the devil's influence out of me. He stayed there, still in hugging range, and said, "It's so wonderful of both of you to make this impromptu trip. Mackenzie won't say it, but she misses you terribly." I cringed when he called me Mackenzie, and my mother beamed. I don't know if it was her aversion to Max was just because she thought it was a boy's name, or if calling me by a nickname reminded her of Alexandria, of Alex. She looked at me over his shoulder, and there were tears in her eyes. 15 seconds, and he had her crying fucking tears of joy. Were my ex-boyfriends really all that bad in comparison to him? Okay, so I had made the mistake of introducing them to Jake. He'd insisted on them calling him by his nickname, Scissors. But that was a low point, and it had mostly been to piss them off. Not all of them had been that bad. My pretend boyfriend turned to my father and said, "Sir, I'm Kate Winston. You raised an amazing daughter." My father shook his hand and said, "Really?" Really. He said, "Really. No, thank you," or I know. It took him a full 5 seconds before he smiled, like me being amazing was his doing. He said, "It's nice to meet you, son." They'd already married me off. I needed to sit down.
Would you pick Garrick or Kate? Might as well start off. Because I think most people, if you've read both, you kind of go for
for one or the other. Yeah. That's difficult. I think in my head, most often I would choose Garrick because I think that's what I would want in my in terms of like fantasy guy. But I think in real life, if I were faced with both of them at the same time, I would probably choose Cade. But I like to think that I shy away from nice guys, but I probably don't, not in real life. So probably Garrick, but I would like them both. I'll take either if you have them.